Good afternoon and welcome to this short video clip on chapter 19 of the AS Law textbook, Actus Reus. The word Actus Reus means the guilty or wrongful act. The Law Commission, however, defines the Actus Reus as all the external elements of a criminal offence. That means that if you take an assault, for example, the wrongful act or the actus reus will be unlawfully hitting another person without their consent. If you take theft, for example, it will be the appropriation or the taking of property belonging to another person. So you're looking at the actions of the defendant which are illegal based on either an act of parliament or the common law. In criminal law, there are two main types of offences that we'll be dealing with at A level. The first type of offence is a conduct crime. An example of a conduct crime is where the defendant's behaviour is criminal. So if you take property belonging to another person, it doesn't matter that the other person suffers a detriment or not, that conduct is classed as criminal, and theft is a good example of that. The other type of offence we'll be dealing with is what we call either a consequence or a result crime. An example of a consequence or result crime is murder. In other words, there is no murder until the defendant brings about the prohibited or bad result, which would be the death of another person. The actus reus, or the wrongful act, has to be committed by the defendant voluntarily. This is confirmed in the case of Hill and Baxter. Also, there are certain types of crimes called absolute liability crimes. And the point here is that there are times that the action of the defendant will not be voluntary. In other words, it will be involuntary. Nevertheless, the defendant would still be guilty of an offence. And this is confirmed in the case of Larcenia. It's also important to appreciate that the actus reus of an offence may be committed by what's referred to as a state of affairs. So a typical example of this would be being in possession of illegal substances. So whether you're going to supply those illegal substances or not doesn't really matter. Under an Act of Parliament, you might be guilty of simply being in possession. So you haven't actually done anything, bearing in mind that most of the time the actus reus requires the defendant to do some positive act. But when we talk about state of affairs, it simply means that the defendant is found in a particular situation, such as being in possession of illegal drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, and that can fulfill the actus reus. You have to remember all the time that the prosecution have to prove that the defendant is guilty of an offence because they have committed both the actus reus and the mens rea. Right, so let's quickly move on to another concept referred to as the Good Samaritan rule, which operates in certain European countries, example in France. This simply means that when you're out and about and you find somebody in danger, then you must help them under the Good Samaritan rule. The interesting point to appreciate here is that the Good Samaritan rule does not apply in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. That simply means that if you are visiting a park and somebody accidentally trips and falls and starts bleeding, you can walk away because the Good Samaritan rule does not apply. Now, the most important aspect of understanding actus reus is that even though the Good Samaritan rule doesn't apply, there are certain circumstances where you are required to act. And some of the clear examples of circumstances where you are required to act, in other words, is very similar to the Good Samaritan rule being effective in this country, even though it isn't. So let's have a look at some examples of when you must act. The first example will be when you have a contractual duty. The case of Pitwood, as you've already discovered when you did the case research, tells us that. So if you have a contractual duty, then you must act based on what the contract says you have to do. Sometimes a relationship, such as a family relationship, imposes a duty of care on you looking after, for example, a younger sibling. There are other examples where you might voluntarily invite somebody in and look after them. If you don't look after them properly, then you could be in trouble, as in the case of Stone and Dobinson. The previous example to do with relationships is the case of Gibbons and Proctor. Another example of when you must act is when you inadvertently or accidentally create a dangerous situation. The case of Miller and Santana Bermudez are good examples of cases that suggest that you must act to minimize the risk of harm or injury to others when you accidentally create a dangerous situation. If we move on to a public duty, that's very important indeed. So if you have a public duty, you must do everything within your power to act. Another example that we can look at is the fact that it's very important to remember that another aspect of the Actus Reus is to do with causation. So has the defendant actually caused harm to the victim? So whenever you talk about the Actus Reus, you also have to think about the issue of causation. There are two types of causation: causation in law, which is confirmed in the case of Smith, and causation in fact, confirmed in the case of Paget. Causation in law simply refers to where the defendant has done more than minimum to be blameworthy. Causation, the but-for test, refers to where the defendant would not be, or the victim rather, wouldn't have been injured or harmed had the defendant not behaved in the way that they did. So the key points to remember here is that when it comes to the Actus Reus, you have to remember the definition, the unlawful or wrongful act, or as the Law Commission states, all the external elements of an offence. And the next point to remember is that the Good Samaritan rule doesn't apply in the United Kingdom. However, there are clear examples of when you must act, such as when you're under a statutory duty, when you have a contractual duty, if you create a dangerous situation, if you have or hold public office. These are all quick examples of when it's important that you have to act. That's a quick summary of the Actus Reus. This video will be supplemented by an online lesson and also reference to using your textbooks to supplement your knowledge. Thank you for watching this video.